everyone, and welcome to Talk Nerdy. Today is Monday, February 5th, 2024, and I'm the host of the show, Cara Santa Maria. And as always, before we dive into this week's episode, I do want to thank those of you who make Talk Nerdy possible. Remember, the show is and will always be 100% free to download. I really heavily rely on listener support from people just like you. If you'd like to pledge your support on an episodic basis, all you've got to do is visit patreon.com/talknerdy. This week's top patrons include Daniel Lang, David J.E. Smith, Mary Neva, Brian Holden, David Compton, Gabrielle F. Jaramillo, Joe Wilkinson, Pasquale Gelati, Riva Keith, and Ulrika Hagman. Thank you all so much. All right, let's get into it. This is a really, it was a wonderful chat. We did it a little while ago now, but I still remember it crystal clear. I love this lady, and I think you guys will too. All right, so I had the opportunity to sit down, well, virtually, of course, with Tracy King. She's a writer, producer, and consultant based in both Birmingham and London. She has done a ton of really interesting work as like a marketing consultant, a copywriter, doing PR for newspapers and magazines, writing print columns and other media for a bunch of different outlets that you know about, like really kind of covering the gamut from science, technology, politics, medicine, film, and even video games. And she's also an animation producer. She's really well known for a bunch of different pieces. Probably one that you might know the most is this viral piece that she did animating Tim Minchin's Storm. And then she actually co-wrote and produced a graphic novel based on that. Just very cool. So a lot of fun stuff, but she has a new book out, and that's what we're going to focus on in this episode. It's called Learning to Think, a memoir of faith, superstition, and the courage to ask questions. So without any further ado, here she is, Tracy King. Well, Tracy, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you for having me.
So I'm really excited to talk about your new book, Learning to Think, a memoir of faith, superstition, and the courage to ask questions. You know, I think that I hate to say these kinds of stories because it's your story and it's so very personal, but many individuals who have probably read the book Educated may have had like a little taste, or maybe individuals who watch documentaries about sort of that paradigm shift that occurs for some individuals who are raised in very closed societies or very closed religions to critical thinking, to science, to this sort of anti-pseudoscientific world. I think that these stories are not only fascinating, but there's a lot of hope contained in them. And so I'm just so grateful for you sharing with us, because this is very personal. You putting yourself out there like this.
Yeah, I mean, it's very difficult subject matter because there's a lot of different aspects to the book, and the religion is a background to all of it, but it's by no means the central story. So, for example, the book opens with me being exorcised when I was 12. I mean, there's no good age to be exorcised, but 12 was not 12 was not ideal, because I was just at that point of vulnerability where I thought I knew stuff. You know, for example, yes, I'd like to be exorcised because I'm definitely possessed by demons, but I didn't know enough to say, actually, I have PTSD. Maybe I should have a therapist instead. And that, of course, was the result of living in a very enclosed, very poor, what in Britain we call a council estate, which is social housing, in the 80s. And we were sort of recruited into a fundamentalist Christian religion. So I was baptized as a born-again Christian when I was 9. And as a friend said, you're barely born at 9. How can you be born again? But, when you're a kid, you don't you don't really question what the adults around you are saying. And if a religion comes along and has all the answers to poverty and crime and all the things that we're experiencing, it's very attractive, and there were a lot of positives to it. But the sort of the ultimate message of the book, as you say, is one of hope, and it's family and love. But the sort of the main thrust of the plot deals with the death of my father, which I won't go into in too much detail because spoilers. But it's kind of a murder mystery twist. So to have a religious background to a trauma like that, he died when I just turned 12, and to be in the middle of a religion that tried to frame that as, something very, very different to what I now believe. I think when you've got a grieving child and a grieving family, dealing with a very traumatic, very public death, there's a lot of things that you're going to say in the context of religion that in hindsight I'm quite angry about. And I didn't want to write an angry book, because I don't think that's useful. So I really wanted to focus on the hope and the love and the family, and then the educational side of things, which is incredibly important to me. I stopped attending school regularly when I was 12. I went on and off until I was 16, but between 12 and 16 I had a couple of months of formal schooling. But I was a really bookish, nerdy kid. So I taught myself. And without guidance, that went down some very odd paths. So by the time I'm sort of, 15, 16, I was believing in all sorts of things, conspiracy theorists and, conspiracy theories and lots of sort of magic and pseudoscience, because I was trying to get out of religion, but I still needed answers to all of these big life and death questions that I'd experienced so young. And the main one, I think, is why do terrible things happen to good people? And so, it's the book really, it's about all of those things, and then how I got out of that, simply through finding a book in a secondhand bookstore by Carl Sagan, the astrophysicist, and learned that science exists and that critical thinking exists, and that those are two things that I'm very, very keen on, and that changed my life and my career, and not just the way I think, but the way that I learn, and the way that I respond to the world around me. And that's had an enormous impact on how I've dealt with my history of trauma and my history of poverty and all of those things. So yeah, there's a lot of things in my book, and that's only some of it. There's a whole bunch of other things in there that are very difficult subjects, and I think very timely. My sister was taken into care by social services because she had what's now called school refusal, but at the time it was called school phobia, which in the 80s that kind of wasn't studied. I mean, it's still not really studied. And it was dealt with very badly, and she was taken away and institutionalized.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
So I don't even think we use those terms. I mean, I could be wrong because I'm not a school psychologist, but in clinical psych, we don't use either of those terms here in the States. So I'm wondering if is it like a kind of like a form of oppositional defiant disorder?
No, because she was otherwise the most obedient, lovely, well-mannered
So
child. She had it's a
school.
severe anxiety disorder. So basically, a severe phobia of school. And I mean, it's partly because she was bullied, partly because we were a little different. My family were a little different in the estate where we lived, and for whatever reason, the authorities decided to experiment and put her in well, I mean, at the time we called it a mental institution, which is not a good place to put a vulnerable 11-year-old girl. And thereafter, she was sort of shoved around from different places, and eventually ended up in a school where she did very well. And she's now had a very normal life and a very good career. But for both of us, because we had such disrupted educations, we have, I think, a real sort of, there's two things that can happen when you have a bad school experience. It can either put you off learning for life, or if you're the sort of kid that has the sort of parents that we had, who, they were very interested in our educations. They weren't well educated themselves, but we had a lot of books in our home. My dad had been an engineer in the Air Force, and my mum, she was a stay-at-home mum, but she liked to write poetry and short stories, and we played board games together as a family. So it was a very imaginative, creative environment to grow up in, and because of that sort of love for learning, my sister and I, we just kind of got on with it. We just sort of said, well, school isn't really working for us, and nobody knows what to do with us, but we're just going to teach ourselves. Which is, that's not a route I recommend. But after the pandemic, there were a lot of children who started to have problems going to school.
Yeah,
experiencing
talk
anxiety.
about that being relevant today and sort of parallels happening today. I'm super curious because obviously this is a podcast that's being broadcast from America. I have a pretty mixed audience across the globe, but I would say that, at least the dominant portion of my listenership is American. You probably know quite well that America is a pretty religious country. And, I grew up born and raised in the Mormon church. I've watched a lot of documentaries and read a lot of books about people who are raised in like more fundamentalist religions or who are raised in cults. And I don't know as much about, Birmingham in the 80s. And so I'm curious, was like the born again Christian movement mainstream? Was this a very different thing that your family got involved in? And what was it like for you before you became born again? Like, were you always kind of like religious light, or sort of what was that transition like when you were quite young against the social background?
So it was, there was a bit of everything in the 80s. And I'm going to have to blame America for this a little bit.
No, we'll take it. Yeah, it's fine.
The church that we got involved with was an American church, and they sent missionaries to council estates to recruit families in poverty. And so it was quite a sort of, it was culturally exciting. So our minister and his wife were American. They were young, they were good looking, they were, exciting and interesting. They had all these interesting foods, and they had all these interesting board games, and they talked in a way that I hadn't heard before, and that was very attractive and intriguing. So that was a big part of it. This sort of the Americanness of it, I think, was a big part of the attraction. And then there's a bit in my book where my mom, who was the first to convert, so she had a really severe agoraphobia. So she couldn't leave the house by herself. She couldn't do anything by herself. Couldn't get on a bus. She really didn't have a life outside of our sort of tiny little estate. And so for her to do anything out of her comfort zone was really, really unusual. And then in the mid 80s, Billy Graham came to town. So for your listeners who don't know, he was the big evangelical preacher, and he was friends with the Queen of England. So if anybody's been watching The Crown on Netflix, I think they cover it in one of those seasons. He was this incredibly charismatic figure who came and did a big stadium tour. He did a football stadium tour, and he did 4 nights in Birmingham. And so my mom, who hadn't yet, she'd been sort of going to prayer meetings and talking to the church for a couple of months, but she hadn't yet made the step to, committing herself to born again Christianity. And she went, they hired a minibus, and they went to Aston Villa football stadium. And she, was sat up in the gods, listening to Billy Graham, and that sermon is on YouTube. If you look for Billy Graham Aston Villa on YouTube, that sermon's there. I'm watching it back, and I go through this in the book. It's almost comical to me now that could have worked, because it's so fire and brimstone, and it's almost comically, melodramatic. He's talking about sin, fire, and lasciviousness and lust. But bearing in mind that the audience was mostly very poor people, with very little hope. I understand why his message resonated with my mum. I mean, my dad was an alcoholic, and my mum had all these phobias, and we had all these money problems, my sister's school issues, and it's almost like in that speech that Billy Graham is speaking directly to her. Because he knows, of course, poor people often have, alcohol problems and that kind of money problems, obviously. So he speaks about those things. And she must have been very personally touched by that. And so at the end, what he used to do is say, anybody that wants to come down and commit themselves to Jesus, come down onto the football pitch. And so she did, which for her was huge because she can't do crowds or enclosed spaces or new things and so she went down onto the pitch with all of these thousands of other people, and became a born again Christian. With this sort of enormous kind of mass hysteria almost, and it must have been such an incredible feeling environment. I mean, anything in a stadium is incredible. So that was so new and so exciting, that it was the difference that made it attractive. But there, we weren't one of many. Our church was tiny, a dozen people. You could maybe get 30 people, if you were lucky, on a good day. So it kind of didn't go down well. I mean, before my father died, I was just going to school normally and stuff, and it did isolate me quite a lot, because other kids are quite weird about that. And up until then, it just religion had not been a part of our lives. My parents had a secular marriage. My mum's ethnicity is Jewish, but not in any religious way, just culturally. And there were some artifacts of that. There was some superstition and some occasional, going to shul, or occasionally go to a bar mitzvah, that kind of thing. But really, there was no religious beliefs, and so that caused quite a big division in my maternal family. And then on my father's side, his parents were, kind of English all the way back to the Doomsday Book, that kind of buttoned up, very British Christianity that is our state religion. We have a formal religion, the Church of England, and it's very formal, and it's almost nothing to, like you don't kind of, you don't show your emotions, you don't wave your hands around, you don't kind of sing in tongues, you don't talk about hell, it's just go to church on Sunday, sing some hymns, very nice, go home, almost a formality. So there was a real clash there with families and with friends, and I think we became very isolated as a result of that. And of course, the more isolated you become, the more you rely on your church and the more you rely on your beliefs. And then, of course, I stopped going to school, so it was just my mum and I at home all day together. And that's not a great environment when you're throwing a really extreme religion into the mix. So of course, when I started to show symptoms of severe mental health problems, because my father had been killed, demons, you're possessed by demons. And then once you're the exorcised kid, that's you might as well just paint something on your forehead saying "Don't be my friend," because I mean, I used to walk around the playground reading my New Testament. That was that's not much social.
You're that kid. Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm curious for you, like obviously we talked a little bit about sort of the background, the milieu, the zeitgeist of your upbringing. But for you personally, and I know this is almost, I really think this is almost an impossible question to answer, but of course you had to dig deep when you wrote this memoir, because I personally think that it's very hard to empathize with our past selves. Like we can't unknow the biases that we have now, right? Sort of like you've broken out of the bubble now. And so you have to almost try and put yourself back into the perspective that you had when you were young. But when you were a child, were you just sort of taking what you were fed? Did you buy into all of this hook, line, and sinker? Like, can you even remember what it was like to shift perspective so much as a child?
Yeah, I mean, I was a really precocious child, in good ways as well as really annoying ones. I mean, I was very book smart, and I was very kind of showbiz, all singing, all dancing. I'd like to entertain people. And so it was very hard to tell me what to do. Yeah, we were really well behaved kids, but outside of manners and not getting involved with the wrong kids and that kind of stuff, I really knew my own mind, and I wouldn't. It's difficult, isn't it? Because when you're 9, which is when I was baptized, I don't think you can say any 9-year-old knows their own mind. But if you ask any 9-year-old, they know their own mind. So it's. I remember absolutely believing it all. I remember, because it's such a fear-based religion, I think I was more driven by the fear of going to hell, or the fear of Jesus judging me, and I really, really believed that stuff, which I don't think is a good thing to put into a kid's head.
Yeah,
So
kids are more susceptible to
yeah,
that kind of magical
yeah,
thinking.
and so to revisit that, as an adult, I mean, it's difficult because I've gone through so many different belief systems, and I never really. It's difficult. It was like, I fell in love with Jesus. He was this kind of, this nonsense of a cliche of golden bearded, golden haired, beautiful man who, surrounded by light. And, what little girl isn't going to fall in love with that? And then, like any relationship, some of them go the distance. But when I was 15 or so, I fell out of love with Jesus, and sort of went, oh, actually, I'm not that into this anymore. There was no big revelation like there was getting into it. Um, and it's very hard to put myself into that mindset, because it was sort of, I mean, I think I was looking for something to believe in, for sure. I'd realised that religion wasn't it, but because I subsequently became a rationalist and a critical thinker, sometimes for a living, it is very hard to put myself back into that place where, do you remember believing something that somebody told you without there being any evidence for it? Can I
Right.
remember? And I mean, that's the crux of my book. That's where the twist comes in, because one of the things that frustrates me is, in order to successfully debunk something, or in order to persuade somebody, say they're a conspiracy theorist, that they're wrong, ultimately, you have to understand why they need to believe it. And because I have believed all of these things, I used to believe that aliens built the pyramids and all of this stuff, faces on Mars, all of that kind of nonsense. And so, in writing this book, I really had to analyze why I needed to believe those things. And actually, I don't. This isn't the case for everybody, but oftentimes there is a really good reason, that people don't want to address. So that, in my case, I was redirecting my trauma into belief systems, because it helped to explain the world, because the world was so messed up for me. But if it turns out, oh, aliens did it, or the government is keeping this from me, oh, okay, that makes sense. That explains why I feel so alienated all the time, why I don't feel like I fit in anywhere, when actually it's because I had a whole load of trauma.
I was curious, how much of that sort of pseudoscientific belief structure that you were really, really grappling with when you were young, like what combination is it of you going out on your own to try and find answers, sort of beyond your religion, and really just creating your own sense making of the world, and how much of that was fed by like your mother or by your religious community?
Um, None of it came from my mum, really.
Okay,
Yeah.
okay,
So my mum is very much she's a very vulnerable person, but she's very interested in things, and she likes to have conversations. So when she got involved with the church, I became very active in. We would just sit together and talk about the Bible, and we talk about Jesus, and I would kind of make things up, and she would believe them. So there's an example in my book where we were writing Christmas cards one year, and I got writing Christmas longhand. When you I think I was 12 at the time. It's exhausting. And she said, "Oh, just put Xmas," and I said, "Oh no, we can't put Xmas, because if you put X, you're erasing Christ's name. Right? That
Right.
just
Yeah.
blows my mind. That's a thing, right? That's actually a thing that some Christians think.
Oh, I was totally told that when I was
Yeah,
young. Yeah.
but I just at 12, I come up with this independently, and she went, "Oh yeah, that's a really good point." No, it isn't. It isn't a really good point, but she because she endorsed this belief, that became canon, to me as far as I was concerned. So it's slightly the other way around. And then with the later stuff, it was just me and my library card. So I would just, when I was 15, 16, I would just get all these books out of the library on all sorts of conspiracy theories and so on, and I'd read them, and because I'd had no education, I thought if it was in a book it must be true, which is a very dangerous thing to think, and because a lot of those books are pseudoscience, they make you feel clever, and to a kid who was clever but had no education and no real framework for that, and no critical thinking, I thought, oh, I'm clever now, I know stuff. When of course, the thing that I learned from Carl Sagan is you need to think the opposite way. You need to have humility about your knowledge and your thinking, and that's so it kind of there. Once we're outside of the influence of the church, so we moved to the big city when I was 15. So once we were outside of their direct influence, I was completely self-directed. So there weren't external influences, and there wasn't any internet then. Thank goodness,
Oh, right. Right.
because I
Yeah.
don't know where that
Yeah.
would have ended. So I actually, if you'd said, I mean, a lot of those conspiracy theory books were, the alien stuff, it was really popular in sort of 1990, 1991. So you would occasionally find people who were reading those kind of books. But to really be into it, to really believe it, was actually very hard to find anybody else. And I'm grateful for that because I don't think it would have gone well if I'd managed to find a buddy to, to sort of, yeah,
Own sort of pseudoscience church, your own sort
yeah,
of community.
yeah.
I'm curious, like when you're, let's say, looking around libraries, because that's what we're talking about, right? Or maybe comic book stores, I don't know. But like this is definitely, like you said, before the internet had wide access. What kinds of, like, were there certain sections that you were attracted to? Like, how is it that these are the books that you found long before you found, for example, the Demon Haunted World?
So there used to be. This is actually a money thing, interestingly. So obviously, I couldn't buy new books, and I couldn't buy books that were kind of, I don't know, books that were true, actual science books, because they were expensive. So I could only either get library books or budget books. And at the time, budget bookstores would just sell books that were not necessarily mainstream publishers, certainly weren't mainstream authors or peer reviewed or in any way past any kind of fact checking. So you could be a complete crank and get, publish a book, and a discount bookstore would sell it. Um, so it was skewed heavily towards what I'm going to call new age, I guess. Sort of a lot of the mysticism stuff, a lot of the pseudoscience stuff. So I just kind of bought books because that's all I could afford. Alongside that, there were those bookshops also used to sell classic literature for £1. So I read a huge amount of the classics, Dickens and Hardy, all of that stuff. I was reading War and Peace, and at the same time, I was reading that the aliens left a face on Mars as a message to Earth. So it's a
Right.
very unusual little life I built for myself. But yeah, it basically came down to, if you didn't have money, you didn't have access to the good stuff, to the stuff that's been checked by people who know what they're talking about, or a bookseller who could recommend things. These were just books that would just sell stuff for £1, £1.50. And I didn't know any better. I didn't know that there was a difference in quality or a difference between science and pseudoscience. And it's only thanks to the fortunes of, a second-hand bookstore that had this Sagan book. I think I'd spent, it was £2, I think, and I bought it. It's called The Demon Haunted World, and the cover was black. It's very American design, And it's the subtitle is Science as a Candle in the Dark. And so it's a globe on the front, and it's all sort of, the background is black. And I've never heard of Carl Sagan. And I thought that it was more aliens, conspiracy stuff.
Right. Yeah, I could see that. Oh,
Yeah.
interesting.
And it was cheap.
Yeah.
And I thought
Yeah.
that what I'd been into was science. And I think the section in that bookstore was it was a wooden barrel, and it just got like 5 or 6 books on top and a little sign saying science. And I thought I was into science. I was actually into pseudoscience. And so it was things like, the science of Star Trek, those kind of books that people buy someone for a Christmas present, and they end up in a secondhand bookstore. And then just this Saga one sitting on top. So I found out purely by accident what I'd been doing wrong. And and it was I don't mean in a revelatory way. It wasn't like, it's not like when you find religion and you read the Bible and a light bulb goes off because you've had a spiritual connection. It was just simply, here's a toolkit of how things can be tested. Here are some things historically that people have claimed, and here's how the testing went. And in that book, Sagan directly addresses some of the conspiracy theory alien stuff that I've been reading, and explains how cherry picking works. How you can use data to show anything that you want.
Confirmation bias. He's
all of that
so
stuff,
good at
and
helping us
logical
understand
fallacies,
that.
and all of these things.
Yeah.
And he talked about astrology and Barnum statements and all of this stuff. And I just went, okay. It's as simple as that. It wasn't this big sort of light bulb revelation. I just went, okay. I've just learned that learning itself is a process. You don't just read a fact in a book and go, I know that now. That's not it. Actually, it's a process, and science is a process, and you're allowed to be dissatisfied. But it's also okay to not get answers. And, because I've spent my life up until then looking for answers, the big answers to the big questions, life, the universe, and everything, that I just sort of realised, actually, it's okay to go, well, that's a big question. We don't know yet. Here are the people that are looking into it. Here's what the evidence is so far. Can you be satisfied with not knowing? Is it okay to say, I was wrong about that? Yes, in fact, it's essential to say, I was wrong about that. So that's what I learned from that. And then, of course, that becomes the pivotal moment in my book. That's where the twist comes in, because I started researching my father's death, which was a very complex, difficult thing. There were 5 young boys on our estate, neighbours of ours, were arrested for murder. And there was a trial which collapsed, and a whole conspiracy theory around it. And that was 35 years ago, and I never really thought about it in critical terms, because you don't go back to your trauma in critical terms. Speaking back to what I was saying about the reasons that people need to believe things. Of course, you don't go in your head and think about what you believe about something as traumatic as that and why you believe it. But when you're writing a memoir about it, especially if you're somebody like me who, I need facts and evidence. So I started to investigate, and I got the police report eventually, and started to interview people, and discovered a big twist in the tale. So I ended up applying all the critical thinking that it forms the basis of my career, and I would say my sort of personal culture. I applied that to the most important event in my own life story, and discovered I was wrong.
Wow. Gosh, there's so many questions are popping up for me. There's so many different directions we can go, and at the risk of like taking linearity out of the conversation, kind of fast forwarding a little bit, I'm super curious. Obviously, so much of your, I guess we could call it like enlightenment, came from that veil being lifted, that sort of understanding that science is a method, and that that there are tools that we can use to sort of test whether or not our previously held notions, our pseudoscientific notions, hold water. But I'm also super curious, how much was mental health treatment central to this growth and this ability to develop self-confidence, to develop a sense of scientific, maybe confidence in your
in your adult development? Because clearly you were struggling with some really intense trauma, and really facing that head on and working on it had to have been significant, right?
Yeah, I mean, I've had therapy on and off, for the last sort of 30 years. I mean, there's a lot of strands to that. One, of course, came down to money because, for the first sort of 25, 30 years of my life, I didn't have any. And if you grow up in extreme poverty, as we did, my parents didn't work a lot of the time. My dad was unemployed often. So we were on benefits. So, we had a lot of poverty. And you're playing catch up for the rest of your life, really, because you're not going to inherit anything, and you don't have savings, and nobody's taught you money management, and therapy is expensive. So there's that aspect of things, which was a huge challenge. So I've done a lot of kind of self therapy over the years, which led me down a few blind alleys, but was also very useful. The other issue, of course, is that a lot of therapy is there's a lot of pseudoscience in therapy. So I ended up with a lot of bad therapists, because of the regulation issues. So, it might be somebody who doesn't have any kind of degree, in psychology or psychotherapy. They're setting themselves up as a counsellor, advertising their services, and of course they're the cheapest, and you don't know the difference, when you're 21 and you go, and all they're just sitting there going, I'm sorry to hear that, and so I took a few steps backwards there. But I think the main issue was any therapy that I ever had, of course, was talking about my dad's death and all of the trauma around that. And I had the story wrong. What happened to my dad is not what happened to my dad. So it wasn't until I researched for my book and I actually learned the truth that I could properly engage with therapy. And I've been very, very fortunate, firstly, that I can afford quality therapy now, but also to have found just incredible therapists, who have helped me navigate through this, this revelation of 35 years of carrying an injustice that was misguided, and a very warped sense of right and wrong and goodies and baddies, and all that getting flipped on its head. That to sort of apply critical thinking to the therapeutic process, that's not something I'd ever needed to do before, because I didn't know I was wrong about why I had mental health problems. And
Yeah.
now, obviously it was unbelievably difficult writing this book. It was very, very hard. Just anyway, writing a memoir is hard anyway, but writing one where you find out so many revelatory things, that I needed a lot of help. I needed a lot of mental health support, and I'm very lucky. I've got an amazing partner, an amazing family and friends, but I needed professional help. But to do that in a way where I was also trying to think critically about all of the therapy I previously had. Some of it had actively harmed me. Some of it was just useless, So yeah, it's a real mixed one. I mean, I certainly wouldn't have got through my life without therapy. That's for sure. But I wish I'd known more about how to be critical about therapy before before I'd had some of it, or before I'd believed some of what was being told to me.
Yeah, it's such a tough thing. I think sometimes we think about how there's like medicine and then there's like woo. But then with therapy, oftentimes it's on a spectrum within therapy, and maybe recontextualizing culturally that there's legitimate psychotherapy and then there's woo, right? So like there's the bad stuff, the religiously oriented stuff, or the new agey stuff is right there with potions and snake oil and non-legitimate medicine. But we often think of there being sort of a legitimate and illegitimate side of medicine, and that therapy just is on a spectrum, which is, I think, can be detrimental for those who are first entering into the mental health arena.
Yeah, and I'm very good at decoupling the woo from the useful stuff. But mainly because I'm knowledgeable about these things, part because it's my job. But the a lot of the stuff that people are attracted to that is not evidence based. Again, there are very good reasons why that's helpful to them. And so, I would always say, there'll be, I don't know, some therapeutic practice will say, well, that's not evidence based. It's nonsense ultimately. Oh, but it really worked for me. And you can't say to somebody, well, you're wrong, you didn't, because they're not wrong. It did work for them, in inverted commas. What, and they're not really in the headspace for you to sit down and say, let's talk about why it worked for you. What
Exactly.
things
Yeah.
are there that are evidence based that might work better, because it worked for them, and I don't want to take that away from anybody, because that might be how somebody gets through their day. So I'm very good at decoupling those things. So, for example, I find yoga very beneficial. The stretching is and the mindfulness, the quietness is very beneficial to me. But it comes with a bunch of stuff that I don't believe. And
100%. I
yeah,
used to have a yoga instructor that did atheist yoga, and I loved it.
yeah, and so
Yeah.
so to be and actually it's a bit of a trend now. I've noticed in London that there is that sort of secular yoga, because I think a lot of
Right.
people are like, well, I like the stretching and that's beneficial, but actually that's what works. And it's so if the stretching works, and we know that works, there's good evidence for that. But if you put in all the other stuff and then tell people it's working because of that, I have an issue with that. But then, for me, I used to get really wound up by it, but now I just sort of mentally decouple it. So if I did go to a yoga session and there is somebody, being very zen about stuff, and telling me to, ask the universe for things or whatever, I just ignore it. I'd love to sit there and lecture them on why the universe almost certainly doesn't work that way, and why it's arrogant to think it does, and ultimately unhelpful, because you're going to be in for a big disappointment when you realise that you can't control things in that way. You need to work on the things you can control. But that doesn't help either. People don't easily, you can't easily reason somebody out of something that's helping them. And so I don't, because I don't want to be a dick. But
I love, the point, sorry to interject. I get so excited when we talk about these things, because I think that a lot of people listening to the show, I can't speak for all of them, but there may be a portion of individuals listening, because of the nature of my show, have had their own mini version of your story. And obviously it's not the same story. Everybody's story is unique, but a moment where they left their church, or a moment where they left the woo, or a moment where they started to think more critically about the world, and have those experiences. And I can't speak for others. I can speak for myself and for some of my friends, but many of us went through a time when we first left whatever, like when I left the Mormon church, for example, where I was like angsty, and I became very firebrand in my atheism. And I was very, exactly like you said, like I'd love to just tell people why they're wrong, or I'd love to, like I was mad and I wanted the world to understand why I was mad. And then, things softened, and I started to realize not only that that was ineffective, but it also wasn't very compassionate or kind. Um, and it's fascinating to me how many people go through a very similar transformation. It reminds me a lot of when I first quit smoking cigarettes.
yes,
And I was
exactly
like,
that. Yeah,
so, right? Like I was like so
yeah,
angry about, like I was, how could you smoke a cigarette? It's so disgusting. It's like, that was me like a week ago.
yeah,
Like I have no right to be that
yes,
way.
yeah. Absolutely that. Absolutely that. And I mean, the thing that I focus on is, individuals are not, they're not my business. If people want to have a conversation, if an individual wants to have a conversation, that's great, if they're open to it. And I used to debate conspiracy theories. So a thing that used to happen a lot is that, for example, a 9/11 conspiracy theorist, they'd come along. And people, start trying to engage with them on a factual basis and say, jet fuel can't melt steel beams. Well, it can. Here's the science that shows it can. And I learned very quickly, don't do that, because you don't yet know if that person is actually interested in challenging what they believe. Ask them, what evidence would it take to change your mind? And 9 times out of 10, those people would say, there's no evidence you could give me that would change my mind.
Right.
And then you just walk away.
Right.
You just walk away.
Yeah, because it's a faith thing at that
Yeah, and
point.
they
And
need
it's
that
like,
for
what can you do with that?
whatever reason, because they feel
Hmm.
disenfranchised, or for whatever the reason is. You aren't going to tackle that underlying reason. You can't just throw facts at them. It's not going to work. That's not why they're in this. So I learned not to do that quite quickly. But also, I think individuals, because I've been through this myself and I've had all those beliefs, I know why I had those beliefs, and I don't think it's fair to people to start being mean to them or challenging them or making them feel stupid, because they're not stupid. They have very good reasons. Um, for me, it's about institutions. It's about, what the government is doing. So, for example, in this country, the NHS used to spend a lot of money on homeopathy, a lot, millions and millions and millions of pounds. And our now king, previously Prince Charles, he's really big into this, and so a lot of it was driven by him. And so there was a skeptic group in the UK who basically challenged the government. And
Merseyside skeptics.
Yeah, incredible
yes,
people.
We've had Marsh on the show before.
Amazing. Well, yeah, and he just basically said, right, on an individual basis, we get why people want to use homeopathy, and they're being sold it by people who they've got no reason to disbelieve. That's not how you tackle it. You can't tackle it individually. You need to say to the government, here is the evidence. Please go and have a debate in Parliament and then stop funding this. And they were successful. They got it defunded. And that's how you do it. So, when I see, for example, the government at the moment, they're really hung up on lie detector tests. They really, and lie detection is pseudoscience, and it's dangerous pseudoscience. And so they're doing things like they're having prisoners who are up for release for domestic violence offences. They're having them do lie detector tests to figure out whether or not they're safe to release them back into the community. And this horrifies me because, domestic violence statistics in this country are really, really awful. And if you're going to let somebody out of prison who has a conviction for domestic violence, there's a risk to the life of any woman that they become involved with. That really can't be on the basis of a lie detector test. That's not okay. So that's the sort of thing that I go for. Is like, right, this is a systemic issue, or it's a legal issue, it's a government issue, or a private company is doing something that is not evidence based, or obviously marketing is absolutely chock full of that.
Yeah. And there is a big difference, I think, between, and maybe it's not a completely fair sort of categorization. Of course, as human beings, we love to put things into buckets and categorize them, even when those are arbitrary. But this idea that there are sort of like victims of pseudoscience and there are perpetrators of pseudoscience. And yes, the line gets very, very blurred, but there are almost anytime I see somebody who's an individual person who's partaking and maybe even spreading the sort of gospel of pseudoscience, very often there is an intentional campaign. There are individuals behind that with power or with money or with influence who are pushing certain types of agendas, whether it be to make money, whether it be to maintain power and control. And I think we often don't bother looking at that and we just blame the victims.
Yes, absolutely that. And I'm very, very sympathetic. Like I say, because I have had those beliefs and because I have, anxiety and PTSD and all of those things, and I know how attractive those things could be. And also because oftentimes there simply isn't a viable alternative. I mean, if you go to a homeopath, you're going to get an hour with a really sympathetic person who'll give you a cup of tea and you can tell them all of your problems and your life history and they'll listen and they'll sympathise. Or you can spend 6 minutes with your GP. You've had the most stressful time trying to even get an appointment. Sometimes it takes months. The NHS is so underfunded and overstretched, and you feel like they're not properly listening to you, and you go away feeling like you've achieved nothing and you haven't got anything useful, or just keep an eye on it, or it's probably stress, or well, I'll write you a referral letter, but the waiting list is 3 years. Like an hour with somebody, tea and sympathy goes a long, long, long way, and you will feel better after that. I would feel better after that. Like recently, I accidentally had reflexology. I didn't mean to. I went. It wasn't just random.
To be fair, I do that a lot because I love me a good Chinese foot massage.
Right, exactly that.
Yeah,
so,
yeah.
It wasn't like drive-by reflexology. I went for a massage with a new therapist, and she did reflexology. And if it wasn't the best foot massage I've ever had in my life, and I felt like
exactly. It's like, just don't talk, please.
Yes, and it was because it feels really nice to have somebody poking your feet. It feels amazing because there's muscles in there. You're standing on them all day, and I was like, oh, I wish I just wish that I could just go to her and say, just do the lovely poking. I don't need the rest.
Don't tell me how it's connected to my liver, please.
I'm sure she believes that, and maybe her passion is, maybe that's a driver of of why she does what she does. But it still felt amazing, regardless. And also, a lot of these things. I mean, we talk a lot about placebo, and which I think can be overrated as an explanation.
I agree.
I don't think, I mean, I think, and also I think everybody has anxiety now since the pandemic, because we just spent
Yeah.
a couple of years thinking, I'm going to die. There's an invisible enemy. We can't fight it. Nobody knows what's going on. I don't know who to trust. I'm terrified for myself, my loved ones, and society in general. We're in a dystopia now, right? So there's a lot of residual trauma and anxiety. And so you want things, you're going to seek out things that lower your blood pressure, that make you feel mindful, that take you out of your head, that make you, because you're so tense all the time. I mean, if I say unclench your jaw, everybody that's listening right now is going to realize their jaw is clenched. It's a 24-hour thing that we're living with all of this tension and anxiety, and those kind of therapeutic interventions, whether it's the homeopath who sits and listens, or the reflexologist who's rubbing your feet, they do feel good. They feel really amazing, and it's an anxiety relief thing, which is why that stuff's on the rise, and
Right.
will continue to
Yeah,
be.
in a particular way they work. It's just not the way that they're being claimed to work.
Yeah, and and
Yeah.
it does wind me up because, of course, I have no problem. I'm fine with whatever people want to believe. I have an issue with when people expect me to believe it, or if they
Right.
start taking,
Or fund it. Yeah,
yeah,
for your tax
exactly,
dollars to go
funding, or
towards it.
yeah,
Yeah.
and then of course the extreme end of that is people die because of this stuff, and so very obviously you can't just ignore it and go, well, it's fine because some of it feels nice. Well, if you need actual medicine and you're just taking alternative medicine, that's not going to go well. So it's serious and it's important, but it's also fulfilling a societal need. A lot of the stuff that isn't being addressed anywhere else, and we have to understand that this stuff doesn't go away. Whilst in this country, if you've got a mental health problem, the NHS tries their best, but the funding isn't there. And there's really not very much help for you other than maybe a prescription. Wait 3 years on the waiting list for therapy. And I've had NHS therapy, and it wasn't great therapy. It was very much just a sort of sitting and chatting sort. It wasn't. I like evidence based therapy. I like really practical. So if somebody's got an alternative or very little money, what are they supposed to do? Just suck it up?
Right. Yeah. I mean, it's a, like you said, an institutional, it's a systemic problem. And very often, like we do with most of these institutional systemic problems, especially that are related to poverty, is we blame the victim or we criminalize the victim or we do all of these other things, which is heartbreaking. And I think it is important for you, as you did in your book, as we're doing on this show, to sort of peel back that curtain and to show it for what it is. I'm curious because I've kept you for so long as it is, and I've got a few questions left. I'm curious, sort of fast forwarding to now, and I think some people might be able to gather, but I would love to hear it explicitly from you. Like, how do you kind of consider your positioning now, your viewpoints? Are you, a secular humanist? Do you identify as an atheist, or are you just more of like a evidence-based scientific skeptic thinker? Like, labels, categories can be kind of complex, but how do you see yourself?
Yeah, I mean, I don't go down the labels and identity route now, mainly because I've learned not to. I did that hard, when I came out of Christianity. I found the word agnostic, via Huxley. I was very excited by that, and then I found atheism, and then hard atheism, and then anti-theism, and then skepticism and organized skepticism and rationalism. And then there were lots of offshoots of all of that stuff. And they had organizations and movements and a lot of incredible people. I made lifelong friends, people who are like me and think like me. And that was very important. But there's a rigidity of thinking that I'm uncomfortable with. Not that I'm open to there might be, aliens on Mars hiding from us. Not that, but that if you worry too much about your identity, you just, you can become really preoccupied with that. It could be a distraction from what you're actually
And it can
trying to
become
do.
dogmatic. Yeah.
Oh, I was so dogmatic. I mean, I still am.
Yeah.
A little bit. So I mean, but I was when I was 5 years old. I mean, if I was
Right.
dogmatic about the difference between Barbie and My Little Pony. I mean, that's just me. I made an animation about 10 years ago with a guy called Tim Minchin. It's called Storm, and it's about a dinner party that he has with a young woman called Storm, and she's a true believer in all sorts of things. And so it's a big straw man argument, and it's basically his big straw man argument against all of the things that I used to be. I used to be the girl Storm. And it's a very, very funny. It's a 10-minute beat poem. It's very funny, and it's a very angry polemic. And it was very popular. I think it's about 6 million views on YouTube now. It took us about 3 years to make. And I love it. It changed my career. It changed my life. But when I watch it back now, it's an incredible distillation of all of the sort of annoyance that I felt at people just spouting stuff that they were, that they didn't have all the facts about. And Tim wrote it in the most incredible way. It's so funny and clever, and it really skewers these kind of annoying ways of thinking where you can't know anything, that kind of thinking where that's just not useful, and you're not going to get anywhere in life. We wouldn't get anywhere in society if you walk around thinking like that. But I think it's really interesting looking back on that now. For me, that kind of in those 10 minutes, that summed up all of the sort of the anger and the label side of things that I need. And in making that animation, I could then just sort of say, right, I've done that. I've put it out there. This is my world
Right.
in a 10-minute beat poem. And now I can just sort of, I don't need any labels, and I kind of, so yeah, I mean, I can, there are labels for the way that I think. I mean, critical thinking is always going to be a label that I apply to the way that I think and the way that I work, because that's a process. Or, as Carl Sagan called it, a baloney detection toolkit. And that's very useful,
Right.
mainly because it saves you a lot of money. You can figure out what's easy, what's fine.
So
right?
true.
So, ultimately, everybody needs it simply for that. But in terms of kind of the other kind of labels, I've been a rationalist, a skeptic, an atheist, an anti-theist, all of this stuff. And I am still all of those things, but they're not formal, in the same way that, I'm originally from Birmingham, and people from Birmingham are called Brummies. And I am a Brummie to my core. But I've lived in London for 16 years, and so I'm a Londoner as well, in the same way. And I'm English, and I'm British, and I'm European. And all of those things are all true at once, and no one of them is more important than the other. So I think I'm getting older, and I'm a lot more chill now, and I feel like I don't want to back myself into these kind of pigeonholes, because some of it is kind of, it can put people off, and I'd rather go and make an animation or write something where I say, these are the facts and here's the culture around it, than say to somebody, I'm a skeptic, listen to me because I know everything, because that's just not true. And and the main lesson in my book is, I've been wrong about a lot of things, and I'm very happy to be wrong about things, and I'll be wrong about things in the future. And the brilliant thing about science is that it is changing all the time, and things that we were sure about 20 years ago, now we know, it's either different or subtly not quite what we thought. That's the point. That's the process.
Right.
And that's also true of all the labels and the identity stuff. But useful for finding communities, useful for knowing what to Google. I think when I found the skeptic community, I think I originally Googled philosophy. And then,
I could see that.
And then from there, I think I Googled critical thinking, and then eventually found skeptic forums and that kind of stuff. So that they're useful for kind of getting you on a little pathway, but I think it can be a bit dangerous to, especially if you've been a believer in a younger age to try and
Right, because then it's
replace
just
that.
like you don't want to be in a new cult. Yeah. And I think also there becomes a synecdoche that can happen. I mean, we've seen it in the skeptic community where like, you've got your Lawrence Krauses and your Richard Dawkins and now it's like that's what people identify with it. And it's like, no, I'm not that. So and I've seen this happen a lot in the skeptic community where it's like it's got the same old white man problem that, most all communities across the globe have. And so, they're it's all people. It's all people and
Yeah,
we're all
yeah. I
very
mean,
flawed.
yeah, and I think just also, these are all necessary phases of progress. I mean that stuff, it was necessary at the time, and I'm glad I got involved with that stuff, and like I said, I've made lifelong friends out of it. And the work that's been done by those people is very, very important. It's all necessary because I mean, like astrology's back now, for example. Astrology went away for ages, in part because of the work of people like Carl Sagan, to point out here's how it works, and that's a bit daft, isn't it? Partly because just the passage of time, the teenagers who were into that in the 60s and the 70s, they just grew up and grew out of it, and then it became that uncool thing that your mum was into, and then another generation, and then suddenly it's, oh, this is interesting, and so it'll pass again. But because that stuff comes back, people have to come along and debunk it again, and it's cyclical. And every time, each time it comes back in a new form. With social media now is a great driver of things like astrology, and again, it's serving a purpose for people who feel a need for that sort of control, and I completely understand why. Because I was that person myself once. And so, someone else will come along. For every TikTok video about astrology, there's another TikTok video saying it doesn't work. It's Barnum statements. Here are the facts. Here's the history. And so that will
Yeah.
eventually spread, and it will go away again. And then in 30 years, it will come back. So that I am all right with that. I don't worry too much about that stuff because I think while there are people who resurrect quite often for financial gain, who will resurrect old stuff, if that stuff's already been debunked, it is quite easy to make it go away.
Right. Right. I'm curious here in the last couple of minutes that we have. I would love to ask you the same question that I ask all the guests on the show. I've not always been great about doing it because I always run over time. But I'm just, your perspective is really, I think, interesting and important to me. So before I dive into my kind of closing questions, is there anything we didn't cover? Is there anything that we wanted to make sure that we hit that I kind of passed over?
No, I think we're good.
Okay, great. So I'm curious, Tracy, when this is a big picture question, but I want you to answer it however it feels right to you. So when you think about the future, and this could be personal or it could be not impersonal, it could be individual or it could be kind of global or even cosmic. First, what is the thing that keeps you up the most at night? Where are you finding difficulty with maybe pessimism or even cynicism, the thing that is worrying you the most? And then on the flip side of that, kind of the follow up is, where are you finding your hope and your optimism? What are you kind of genuinely and authentically looking forward to?
I mean, the thing that keeps me up at night personally is anxiety. I have
Right. It's like
OCD.
an
Yeah,
actual
yeah. I
anxiety.
have
Yeah.
actual
Yeah.
anxiety and I have OCD, which is a big component of that, and that's intrusive thoughts, and that can turn into very paranoid thinking, and because of what happened to my dad, and because of the areas that I grew up in, there's a lot of violence and a lot of crime. Oftentimes it's just I'm simply paranoid that someone's going to hurt me. It's as simple as that. In sort of global terms, things that I worry about. I worry about education more than anything, because it is everything. And I say that as someone who had very little formal education. It's the single most important thing. Without education, we don't have anything. We don't have progress. We don't have hope. And educational standards are becoming difficult to maintain, and one of the things that is slipping in this country, I don't know how it is in America, is the kind of enthusiasm for learning. So there's a bit of sort of anti-intellectual sentiment going about, anti-expert, anti-facts, that kind of anti-science kind of vibe. And that manifests in things like anti-vaccine sentiment, or kind of just being a bit postmodern about facts and that kind of stuff. So that because and that touches on absolutely everything. So that kind of worries me. But the flip side of that, and I'm a very optimistic person, is that firstly that there are a ton of people doing the work, really fighting the good fight to try and improve that. And if somebody like me, with my background, can get a platform, to say the things that I want to say and to tell my story and to, write my book and have it published, that gives me hope. There are people prepared to listen. It's not like everybody's just stopping up their ears and going, I don't want to listen. I haven't found that to be the case at all. And so I think there will always be hope because there are always enough people who are prepared to listen to reason. And I think humans are, we're driven by anecdotes, and that's why it's really important to me to tell a story that has a basis in something real, because it's all very well saying this doesn't work, that doesn't work. How about, but why should I care? What's that got to do with me? So for me to hear people's stories, and at the moment the world is really story driven. That's the good thing about social media, is in many ways it's democratizing, and it's a storytelling platform, and we're hearing stories and perspectives that I've never heard before, and that's so enlightening and so interesting. And I think that that's generating a lot of empathy. Like young people now, they've got so much more empathy and care and just awareness than we had at that age. So that the stuff that gives me hope, I think, is that I think young people are kind and curious, and they are listening to stories.
Yeah. And, I think that there is something hopeful about your story as somebody who was really in it and now has this beautiful perspective. I worry sometimes about sort of the Fox News generation, the individuals who maybe are just now getting in it. And when I say in it, like, that are starting to kind of hook, line, and sinker, have a belief system based on propaganda, based on a kind of closed world where they're hearing the same rhetoric over and over that is antithetical to, evidence-based thinking. It gives me hope when I can see these kinds of stories of people who were in it, and then they realize that there is another way to see, another way to think, and they sort of stumble upon evidence-based thinking and science. And I do sometimes worry about the generation of like boomers or even young people who are sort of falling victim to like the authoritarian like Trump rhetoric that is being spread about. That there's a way out. Like there are alternatives. There are paths that we can take that are evidence-based, that are scientific, that are thoughtful and deep and humanistic. And I think stories like yours, I have to hold on to hope from them, because sometimes I can get kind of cynical and pessimistic when I look around the world that I live in now compared to, I don't know, how I grew up. Especially here in the States, but I think all over the globe we're seeing kind of
Yeah, I mean, I
similar.
think we've been here before. We'll be here again. It always gets better. It's just that it differs in how long it takes. I mean, politically in this country, economically, we are very similar to how we were in the 1980s. A lot of this, child poverty levels are through the roof, and I've seen this before. I lived through it before.
Exactly.
It got better
Yeah.
in the 90s. It will get better. It's just that a lot of people suffer in the meantime. And so what we need to do is recognize that and try and accelerate the getting better process, as much as we can. And that has to be evidence based, because otherwise it just simply doesn't work.
It won't work. Exactly.
Like that's
It
the
just
one
won't
thing
work.
we know. The one constant
Yeah.
is if you have to follow the evidence, because otherwise it just doesn't work. And so, which is why it always wins out in the end. We're not going to. I mean, we might need a new enlightenment at some point in the future, but in the next 100 years or so. But that will happen, and that's fine. People will always progress. even if we regress a little bit, we will always progress, because ultimately the point of evidence is it's the stuff that works. And, if medicine is a very good example of that. You can tell people things that don't work only for a certain amount of time. And then everybody will look around and go, oh, you do realise everybody's dying. And then they'll just stop, so it kind of figures itself out in the end. But yes, I don't like the process of going through it. It does feel very much like the 80s again, and it is depressing and frustrating to me. But I know the work that was done to get us out of that, and that work is being done again now. So I am cheesy, but I do honestly believe ultimately everything will be all right.
Hear, hear. Well, everybody, the book is Learning to Think, a memoir of faith, superstition, and the courage to ask questions by Tracy King. Tracy, thank you so much for spending some time with us today.
Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. And everybody listening, thank you for coming back week after week. I'm really looking forward to the next time we all get together to talk through it.